in a digital age. It will enable new models for sustainable journalism, elevate quality journalism, and ensure that technology allows journalists to do their jobs even better. Because when journalism succeeds, we all do.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Joyce Barnathan, president of the International Center for Journalists, which is a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., that's dedicated to advancing quality journalism worldwide and to empowering journalists with the tools and skills they need to do great reporting. I was hoping one of our panelists is a little late, but hopefully he'll show up very soon. But just to begin, we know that countries across the world are dealing with an unprecedented influx of immigrants and refugees, a record 258 million people moving to new countries in 2017. It's a pretty astounding number. And I don't think this includes internally displaced people who are victims of war and other hardships in parts of the world. And in most of these countries, citizens are inundated with misinformation and disinformation about migration. Sometimes they do this through ignorance, sometimes it's a coordinated campaign to vilify the migrants for a variety of reasons. This is definitely a hot button issue for far-right groups, for autocrats and demagogues, especially the autocrats who are eager to destabilize Western democracies. For the politicians, I should put the demagogues here, who are riding waves of populist nationalism. And sadly, in some cases, some of the perpetrators are even NGOs. And we'll hear about that when our final panelist shows up. Americans, as we mentioned in the little blurb, the Americans are told that the Central American caravan of asylum seekers is filled with terrorists and criminals, stoking all this fear-mongering gets to the population and forms opinions. Europeans are told that Muslim refugees from Africa and the Middle East and Asia are also either terrorists or seeking to impose Sharia law in their new homes. So in this panel, we'll hear from experts in the US, Europe, and Africa about this nefarious trend and how journalists can cover these migration in a responsible way and fight disinformation. So let me introduce our panelists. Joan Donovan is the Director of Technology and Social Change Research at the Shorenstein Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. Abubakar Ibrahim, who is the features editor for the Daily Trust in Abuja, Nigeria. He is also a well-known author. I tried to friend him on Facebook last night, and I got a response that he already has 5,000 friends. So try again, lady. He said he's going to delete some of his friends to make room for me, so I'm very honored. I do want to add that my organization, a couple of years ago, set up an award in honor of Michael Elliott, a very distinguished editor from The Economist, Newsweek, and Time, who was also the head of Bono's foundation. And Mike mentioned when he was dying that he would like to have an award in his name for excellence in African storytelling, and Abubakar has won that award last year. And last but not least is Jacopo Ottaviani, who is Italian, and he is one of our ICFJ Knight Fellows and a Chief Data Officer for Code for Africa. He works in many African countries, and he speaks Pidgin, Nigerian, and many other languages. Very impressive. So let's, I will leave about 15 minutes for questions at the end, and we hope that we can have your questions, particularly if we missed a part of the world and there's some point you want to make, please do. But let's start with Joan and how you would describe the issue of disinformation and immigration in the U.S., which is definitely an issue that our president hits on almost on a daily basis.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Can everybody hear me okay? Sounds good back there? Or maybe I should move this closer. Okay, now I can use my real voice. No, wake up, wakey wakey. All right, it's early. I know everybody was out last night, and this is a difficult topic to talk about, I think, because one of the things I think we, like as an international community of journalists and researchers, pride ourselves on is that we like to tell the stories of human dignity, right? We like to tell stories of people that triumph and that overcome odds and obstacles. And it's been a really difficult past few years as we see the rise of right-wing populist movements that unfortunately, around the issue of immigration, really use that immigration issue as a wedge issue to push a very white nationalist or white supremacist political platform. So without using the words white supremacy and white nationalism, you can talk about immigration and achieve the same goals. And so we've seen this as someone who does a lot of research across different US and mainly European issues around disinformation. What I see is that time and time again, immigration comes up as a wedge issue that is used to polarize people. Now, I'll tell you, in the US, the idea of immigration is one that is foundational to the way in which Americans tell themselves their story about themselves. You know, a lot of people in America say, oh, America is a nation of immigrants. And that's to bury the history of indigenous displacement and some might say genocide. So Americans love to tell a story of triumph about themselves around this issue. Since 2015, I've been tracking the rise of white supremacist and white nationalist movements and the way in which they formed a broad coalition to support Trump's candidacy. And one of the things that happens when we talk about the relationship between social movements and street movements and politics is that politicians often open up a set of political opportunities for fringe groups to come in and start to drive some of the public conversation. So we've seen white nationalist movements turn into citizen journalist outlets. Or for instance, Breitbart, which is an online news organization, take up the issue of immigration in order to push a very particular political agenda. And so the way in which disinformation allows different groups of people to masquerade as journalists and to promote this white nationalist political platform has been at the center of the research that I've done for the past several years. And I'll just close a bit by saying that the issue of migration in the United States, especially as it happens around the Mexico border. I lived in Southern California for 7 years. It's a difficult issue. You have around that area, you have families that are separated by a border but might only live 5 miles from one another. And so you do have to have some porousness around that area because this is how the economy and the locals live in that area. But the way in which the national media, aided by the crisis that Trump wants you to believe about immigration, has really made that particular area both a place that journalists come to, but also a way in which we can come to check and to think about, well, what is the evidence basis that we would need to talk about what is really happening at the southern border? And so when I look at the media coverage of it, I look for things like, do I see the same clip being showed over and over and over of people behind a fence waiting impatiently for something? And the answer is yes. We don't see the crisis daily, right? And so even if it's covered in the news daily, this idea that there are waves and waves and waves of people that are rattling these fences and climbing over these border walls is just not true. And so as journalists, it's really important that we get people begin to tell those stories and to check those facts.
Let me ask you, Joan, we have a particularly big challenge when the demagogue is a head of state and defining day in and day out what the issue is as he sees it. And how do journalists even begin to counteract that? Even if you put some people on the ground to tell the story, you're still up against this huge machinery of, in our case, one of the most powerful people in the world telling this story over and over and over again. And so I'm curious as to what you think the response is to that for the media.
Yeah, it's actually it's a really hard question, because journalists, even in debunking stories, we tend to bring a lot of attention to it, and then those efforts at debunking can be turned back and turned into political fodder. Sometimes I know a lot of journalists in this space get harassed online quite a bit for telling the stories of migrants at the U.S. border, for talking about immigration in a way that doesn't fit the party line, especially as it comes to what Trump is saying. But those stories have to be told. For instance, we don't have as much coverage as we need about what's happening at detention centers down at the U.S.-Mexico border. When we do get stories on the detention centers, they are often horrific, right? And it's very hard to get access. And so I think, though, that you know, that kind of being in the place and getting to know the people there and being embedded is an important aspect by which journalists can tell these stories, and that it does crack through. Eventually, they aren't always able to override public opinion. And one of the things that I would hope is that stories like these do provide footing for other Republicans to challenge Trump's version of this crisis.
One more thing, you mentioned right-wing groups. Do you see? I don't want to sound like a global conspiratory person, but do you see the right-wing movements in the U.S. influencing right-wing groups or emboldening right-wing groups elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, so one of the things that me and a few researchers looked at very closely after the assaults on Muslims in Christchurch was to think about, well, to what degree is this manifesto put forward by this attacker influenced by the US or European versions of white nationalist platforms? And in that manifesto, you see two things happening. One is a very old theory of white nationalism at play, which is to say, he begins the manifesto with this line, it's the birth rates, which is this invocation of this theory of white genocide or white decline, that white people are being erased from this world quietly. That's not true, but it's a very powerful motivating factor for someone to become mobilized to try to kick off a white revolution, as they would have it. And so the other thing we see happening in this manifesto is American-style meme culture, right? He was thoroughly online, and so the influence of message boards, anonymous message boards on this young person and white supremacists and white national memes is littered throughout this document. And so those things, when I look at how white supremacy really shapes the way in which we talk about the relationships between borders, the other thing that we can see is around this meme called No More Brother Wars. There's an international group of white supremacists that believe that strong national borders internally in different majority white countries will lead to greater global sovereignty for white culture and white people. And that kind of dog whistle to one another through the internet allows these groups to proliferate without actually having to organize together, right? So they can share tactics, they can share ideas, they can share memes, but they don't actually have to all show up in the same place and fight as a unified movement.
Jacopo, why don't you talk about the situation in Europe and covering disinformation and migration, which is also a huge issue.
Yeah, it's definitely a huge issue in Europe. In Italy in particular, we are really exposed to this kind of issue because we are on the Mediterranean Sea together with Greece and Spain. And I think Italians have been exposed to news around migration for years and years now. Every day there is something going on in the Mediterranean Sea that is being reported on. And the way it's been reported has been controversial, I think, for many reasons. First of all, the news in general tend to focus on single episodes without trying to give a broader picture of the phenomenon. This is something that we can see every day. Rather than giving a larger picture of what migration is in the world, they focus on a single tragic event, be that a shipwreck or something else happening in Europe along the borders. People think that migration is only about deaths, blood, and tragedies, while migration is actually much more complex than that. Secondly, I think there is a lack of data literacy among journalists and among viewers, users, and readers. And this also undermines the quality of the information that circulates on social media and on the news.
Can you explain that a little bit more? Like, how is the data being manipulated so that it appears as disinformation?
So it's being manipulated in many, many different ways. Sometimes it's not even manipulated on purpose, but it's just misrepresented either because of ignorance or because of a malicious intent of the journalist who want to create an emotional impact on the readers. For example, something that can be done, you provide the absolute numbers of migrants without explaining the total population where these migrants are arriving or are moving to. And by doing so, you basically let people feel like there is an invasion going on. But if you see at the numbers from a relative perspective, by contextualizing that number into the overall population of the continent, for example, of the country, you realize that a very small percentage of people in that country are actual migrants or refugees or asylum seekers. Then there is a problem in terms of terminology. There is a huge confusion around these categories. I think the Pew Research Institute made a research on the perception of Europeans in all the countries of Europe, and I think also in other parts of the world, showing how people are actually confused about migration. They don't know what's going on. They don't know how to distinguish these categories. They don't know the difference between an asylum seeker, a refugee, an economic migrant. It's a mess, and that doesn't help the rationalization among the citizens. There was a survey from the Pew Institute of Research showing how people perceive that the number of migrants is way higher than it really is in Italy, for example. That's probably a consequence of this kind of poor information around this topic. And then I want to mention another example. Just a few, I think about like 15 minutes ago, before starting the panel, I tweeted out an image on my Twitter account, so you can find it there, that was used by apparently a random person on Facebook. It's a picture showing like a huge crowd of people along a beach in the person says that these people are in Libya, and there are like thousands of people, and they are ready to set off to Italy. But then an analysis of this image shows that that image is from a Pink Floyd concert from 1989 in Venice. That picture was shared by thousands of people on Facebook and Twitter, and we don't know how many people WhatsApped it on groups and Facebook Messenger, because it's very difficult to track the number of people who use this kind of private means. And that image was a hoax, but I'm sure it had an effect on people. So you see, it's a very complex kind of combination of factors around this disinformation going on.
As you see it, who are the various sources of disinformation?
So I think the sources are many. Sometimes the sources are journalists who are just not data literate enough to understand the real issue. Sometimes the sources are politicians who try to trigger a battle among have-nots. We call it in Italian guerra tra poveri, which literally means basically trying to pit people against one another in order to divert their attention from the real issues. Because I think just yesterday there was an episode in Rome around migration, around Roma people, and people are just think that they are under invasion, but it's not true. So it's a matter of data literacy among users and among journalists. Sometimes it's malicious, sometimes it's propaganda, sometimes it's just ignorance, and it's the result of an action that is not really deliberate.
And the rise of populism in...
Oh, yes.
You want to talk how that plays into it?
Absolutely. So the current government is really leveraging this issue in order to gain votes. And in my opinion, migration is an issue. We need to approach it rationally. We don't need to leverage emotions around that. Especially we don't need to leverage or like trigger negative emotions around this topic, around this issue. We need to act rationally. And to do so, we need data-driven, fact-driven, verified information on social media, on the news, on television, on newspapers, in order to improve the public debate around it.
Let's move to Nigeria and give Abubakar the mic. Abubakar, as I understand it from our previous discussion, it's not so much an immigration issue as internally displaced people, IDPs. What is the situation in Nigeria with IDPs? And first, give us a little bit of background, like who is displaced and who is spreading the disinformation?
Before I talk about that, I'd like to add to what Jacopo was talking about the manipulation of data for either political gains or whatever. And, yesterday we were mentioning this issue of rising bicycle thefts in Russia, in certain towns in Russia, where you have a high number of Ukrainian immigrants, right? And people use this data, manipulated it, and said, well, it's the Ukrainians who are coming in and stealing the bikes, right? Because they are immigrants. They are leaving their homes and are here in Russia, and, So people tend to use information like that. And similarly in Nigeria as well, so in the northeast of Nigeria, where Boko Haram is prevalent, traditionally there has been a lower HIV/AIDS infection rate. And then suddenly they noticed an increase. And of course it's natural, there's a war going on, right? And some NGOs decided to manipulate the figures and say, well, there are like 4,000 people who are infected with HIV/AIDS, and they are spreading this, and they are, and this is what the NGO said, they are internally displaced people, right, who are living in internally displaced people's camp, and they leave the camps, go out to town because they have to find subsistence. And in the process of finding subsistence, they engage in sexual activities with other people and spread HIV/AIDS. Now, this is a manipulation of information for the purpose of, in this case, it's not political, it's economical, right? The NGO wanted more money. And apparently the government is supposed to be counter-funding a project that is supposed to take care of people infected with HIV/AIDS. The government apparently, according to the NGO, hasn't delivered. So they thought using this information and putting it out there would kind of help their cause and, get more funding. So these are issues that are real. People manipulate information in this way, right? In Northeast Nigeria, we have, at the last count, we have about 2.4 million people displaced by Boko Haram. They are IDPs, they are not refugees. The difference is that refugees cross international borders. IDPs remain within their own country. So this, in a way, is, there are people who are similar to the people that are hosting them. They speak the same languages, they speak the same, they belong to the same religion. They're essentially the same people. It's all that these people have been displaced. And that brings about some fears, some insecurities, so whereas there's a lot of generosity towards these people, there's also the fear that, well, there's a rising HIV/AIDS infection rates, and it's the fault of these people. They are promiscuous, and that word has been used a lot, promiscuous. And even in the media, there's this judgment of these people as being immoral simply because they have been displaced. And that's the situation. 2.4 million people displaced within a region of a country. It's disturbing.
Yeah, I find it particularly disturbing that NGOs are manipulating the truth to gain more money.
Yeah.
But this promiscuity issue seems to be also sort of a women's issue too. It's targeting particularly the displaced women, right?
Absolutely. And the report I mentioned specified that this 4,000 women, not 4,000 men or 4,000 people. It specified that the 4,000 women
are spreading
AIDS. So the Northeast and the north of Nigeria generally is more conservative than the rest of the country. So this idea of being morally upright is predominant. And where you have people having sexual relations out of marriage, it becomes a major issue. And, you have religious leaders using that to kind of gain popularity as well. And the NGOs using it to appeal to religious leaders who appeal to the people. And you have all this cyclical effect of all of it going on.
And the media doesn't go and report on the ground about what's actually happening?
It's a shame that, there are lots of lazy journalists out there. People who rely on, well, it's the truth, a lot of them rely on handouts from NGOs. And the NGOs cook up figures and they decide, well, we want you to push out this information, right? Because if you do get certain benefits from it. So they hand this out to the journalists and the journalists propagate it. It's sort of like somebody is doing our jobs for us, right? We don't have to go to the field and do all of this. They've done it, they've collected the data, and they're NGOs, they're supposed to be reliable. It's not always the case. And even if they are reliable, they have ulterior motives in some instances, and I think the issue is that journalists need to do their homework, basically. They need to work. They need to go to the field and verify. It's not a problem getting figures from NGOs, but you have to verify. You have to go to the field and relate this and give context. And that's what makes journalism. It's not social media that you post anything you see. You need to create that context and, put it out there.
Do either of you have other examples of how other perpetrators of disinformation besides the people we've spoken about or the groups we've talked about?
I think in the U.S., one of the things that we see is we see a pretty sharp divide in the NGOs that are put on Fox News as opposed to almost any other information source. And so there's a group in particular that the Center for Immigration Studies has a very banal name, right? Sounds good to me, right? You're an expert on immigration from the Center for Information Studies? Great, love to talk to you. This group has been designated as a hate organization by the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is an independent group that charts hate groups, as well as they do a hate map every year. And they're, up until this year, have been a pretty well-respected organization that's been around for a few decades. But the SPLC itself has been undergoing a lot of both internal dysfunction, but I still think that their data is pretty good, and the legacy of their data as an organization's been pretty good, easy to check out. But if you do look up SPLC as of today, you will get a lot of different information about them. But back to the Center for Immigration Studies. So this is a group that is often on the Tucker Carlson show, which is like a primetime news show. And what they do is they come in and they stoke the flames and the animosity towards Americans, towards any kind of immigrant. And I think that the comment you made about nobody's making any differences between the categories of how people end up here. This is something that plays out in the U.S. a lot, because we see colorism or racism against black and brown immigrants, and we don't see it against European immigrants from more majority white nations. We don't see the same kind of demagoguery and frames about amorality. And so I would say that this issue with a group like the Center for Immigration Studies becomes really potent, because what we need then is an organization that can, in some ways, go directly to debunking some of the stories and the statistics that they're putting out there. But at the same time, you don't want to give too much of your power away to these groups that can just literally make things up, right? Like if you start chasing those kind of stories, it can be really difficult to kind of get out of that spiral. And so unfortunately in the US, what I try to do is, if I'm working with a group of people that do have affiliations with NGOs, I try to get a sense of what the backstory is, how long that NGO's been around, what they're known for. And I'm skeptical of organizations that both shape the problem and the solution. I like it most, and this is just the nerd in me talking, when someone is responding to a set of problems that have been really well articulated by other experts. So if Pew and the US Census come out with a bunch of statistics that corroborate each other, but they reveal some kind of deficit or some kind of problem in the world, and an NGO steps in and says, that is the thing that we are trying to solve, it feels a little bit more authentic than it does allowing an NGO to say, oh, we are going to be dealing with this problem and no one else has any verifiable facts about it, but trust us, and our solution is packaged in this way, and please, give us money to solve it this way. And so I really try to get a more holistic sense of how the NGOs are operating in these different spaces.
Let's talk.
Can I just?
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, when she was talking about coloration and all of that, I thought perhaps a lot of us have forgotten this Trump rant about shithole countries. Mm-hmm. Where he said, well, we don't want people from Africa coming here. Why can't we have Norwegians, and Swedes come over? So people from Sweden and Norway, it's fine, they can come over, but people from Africa, no. Arabs, no. South Americans, no. So we need to understand that there's a context to this. It's not just about we don't want people coming here. We don't want a particular kind of people coming here. Right. In Brazil, for instance, there's a disparity. You have migrants coming in, refugees as well. And you have Syrian refugees coming into Brazil, and it takes them like 9 months to get their documentation. Right? But for refugees from Congo, DRC, heading to Brazil, it takes them nothing less than 2 years. It's the same process, but it takes them longer. And you wonder why this disparity, why is all of this happening, right?
Yeah. Let's talk about media coverage and what needs to be done now to address this. Because obviously the state of play as it is now is not sufficient. We're not doing a good enough job to fight the disinformation campaigns. And obviously these are very powerful voices. They could be heads of state that are driving them. What do you think needs to be done? What do we need to do as journalists? Is there something special, that training? Is there something that we need to do to get better tools, or what to deal with this issue?
I think the solution is multidimensional.
Talking to the mic.
I think there is not just one solution, but I think it's actually a combination of measures that should be taken to improve the information around migration, and I think I would say information in general. You mentioned data literacy before, and I think it's a key point. I think we need more data literacy, not just among the journalists, but also among the people. We need more media literacy, I think, among, I think also kids. I think it should be introduced in schools, because I think people should be capable of filtering the information without the intervention of, others or other players. Because I think another challenge is the challenge of filter bubbles, right? I think even if we have an extremely powerful fact-checking initiative online, that initiative is being followed by the people who are probably already capable of detecting fake news on their own. So that's a problem of filter bubbles that also should be approached. I know it's an open challenge, but I think another problem is internal in terms of social media. Social media should probably invest more resources in fact-checking using machine learning and artificial intelligence. They have a lot of resources that could be, and I think they are already trying to do that after, the disasters that happen all over the world. So yeah, there's not just one solution, in my opinion. This is obviously my opinion.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think journalists who cover migration and refugee crisis need to connect to their humanity more, right? We all have our political views. We all have our views about other people, but when we write about refugees and IDPs, we need to really understand what is pushing them to do what they're doing, to leave their homes. I don't think people really just want to up and go. There are some people who want to, and it's always been the case, since the creation of the world, or since whenever the world came into being. People have always moved, and they've moved for different reasons. They've moved for economic reasons, which is why people moved maybe from Africa to Europe in the first place. And it's aspirational. People want to move for different reasons, right? And there are people who are forced out of their homes because of war, because of crisis and conflicts. And that has always been the case. And as long as conflict continues to exist, and it has continued to exist, and as long as aspiration continues to exist, and it will continue to exist for the rest of eternity, because it's human nature, right? People are going to move. And we need to connect with our humanity and understand this is a human thing, right? All this negativity we're having now, it's a trend. It's political, right? White supremacist. Even in South Africa, it's not white supremacy, it's about xenophobia. When people are angry, they can't get jobs, they attack foreigners and say, well, you're taking our jobs. And these are jobs that, in the first place, they are not qualified for. And in most cases, these are private businesses that these people set up. Journalists need to be more empathetic. They need to understand the context of all these issues more. Yeah.
For fear of sounding too promotional, my organization is also trying to find some technology solutions. You mentioned AI, but also we have some Knight Fellows who have come up with a technology where if a tweet that is known to be false is retweeted, that person gets a notification that this is a false message. So there are new things. We have this Truth Buzz initiative where we're trying to put people in the world's 5 largest democracies to come up with ways to get the truth to travel faster than the lies. And as we all know, when you're fact-checking and you come up with a big, long explanation of why this is wrong and wrong and wrong, it takes time, and it also is not the most shareable item on social media. So how you can come up with shareable ways to tell the truth. It's storytelling, truthful storytelling, or how fact-check storytelling. So that whether you use animation or you use data in interesting ways that can travel fast as the lies travel. Did you want to answer that question?
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's a couple of things. I think when we fantasize about the possibility of technological fixes, what we're trying to do is displace some of the anxiety we have about the fact that these are not just nominal disagreements, right? They do come down to human dignity, our capacity to think about and love one another. And when I talk with platform companies about what AI is capable of now, it's really capable of finding words that are bad and removing those words, right? It's pretty good at getting, and you know, pardon my French here, but like pornography or dick pics out of your social streams. There's a bunch of people out there that are like using social streams to share lots and lots of pornography. For the most part, we don't see it. But if you use the internet in the late 90s, you remember, right? Yeah. It was a lot of pornography online, and that didn't go away. Technology and the way in which we dealt with spam helped fix those problems. But it was kind of a technological revolution that went undercover, in the sense that that we don't really mark it as this monumental shift in the way in which we communicate with one another, because it didn't have serious effects on our social institutions. And so when we think about AI, I think we need to like ground our like moonshot idea with a little bit of like, well, what had worked in the past, and how has that changed? The other thing that I often try to get people to think about in terms of like, where else have we seen monumental changes in the organization of society because of technology? And it has a lot to do with social movements, right? So 2011, 2010, 2012, we saw global movements, Occupy, 15M, Black Lives Matter. In Italy, there were many different movements of the people united around what we might call hashtag campaigns. Arab Spring, all of these different moments in time where social media were fundamental to the reorganization of local politics and distributed networks. And so one of the things that I've really been trying to understand in the news moment here is we're witnessing a similar moment where we're seeing a decline in the local, a decline in the investment in local journalism, at the same time that we're seeing news reorganize around what you told me this morning are called verticals. But you know, as a researcher, I was thinking like more topically. So you see like single subject newsrooms popping up. The Appeal is one that I like to read. It's like a criminal justice stories. And so you see journalists, rather than getting together and formulating newsrooms in a location so that they see each other, they'll form these virtual newsrooms. And I think that reorganization is something that we might want to spend some more time understanding, and especially around technology as a beat, right? So the technology beat I've seen grow rapidly in the last 2 years. I've seen journalists that have been on the guns and violence beat now become the technology beat, right? It's almost like every journalist has to have some chops in writing about and thinking about technology, but also it's starting to formulate itself as a field. And so as a single subject, I think that we are further ahead in the technology beat as a distributed newsroom than in other verticals, maybe economics, I don't know. So those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about in terms of looking at where change has happened and how change is happening now, where I put some of my my best hopes. It all goes back to the way in which what we want to get out of technology is actually something we must create. And so we have to think with the tools that we have, and we have to think with the history as well.
Let me take your questions now. Feel free to raise your hand. Yes. Identify yourself, please.
My name is Mercy Juma. I work for BBC News in Africa. And I have 2 questions that can be answered by any of the panelists. I walked in 10 minutes late, so I don't know if I missed this, but I'm interested in knowing how or what misinformation we have in regards to migration and religion. Because I feel like what is out there or what is propagated is that migrants who come in and are from a Muslim background are definitely terrorists. I don't know if that's true or not. And then I would also like to hear about misinformation or disinformation on migration, and if it is one-sided, is it only Africans who are migrating? Is it only those people from war areas who are migrating to the EU and all these other countries? Or do we have Europeans migrating to Africa? Is that even a possibility? Because the notion we have out there is that migration is definitely one-sided, but I have seen people who've moved from Europe to Northern Africa or to other parts of Africa in search of a better life and all that.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll start from the second question, and then I'll let the others respond.
I think
to the
we did
first
talk about the first question a bit.
Yeah,
But
if you want to add anything later about that. On the second question about Europeans migrating, the answer is yes. Europeans have been migrating, I think, in all history. You can think of the Italian migrants moving to the US, for example. There are a lot of Italians in New York. Many. We're talking about millions of people. Nowadays, Italians are still migrating, but they are mostly going to other European countries in the north, looking for jobs. There are, I think, tens of thousands of migrants, young migrants mostly, who are unemployed in Italy or Spain or Greece or Portugal or Romania or Bulgaria, from the poorest countries in Europe, where the unemployment rates are high. And they are moving away, mostly within the Schengen space, because they don't need a visa to do so. But I agree with you, there are other trends going on of Europeans moving to Africa, looking for jobs. I can think of a very emblematic data episodes, like a statistics that I came across, I think a few years ago. I think we're talking about 2010, right after the huge crisis, the financial crisis that hit the world. So at some point, Portuguese migrants were banned from Mozambique because there were too many. So the visas that were very easy to get for Portuguese in 2010, at some point the Mozambican government decided to stop it because there were too many. So there was a very kind of change of directions, which is very ironic in a way, because ex-colonialists are being banned by the colonies, which is very interesting. And it happened. Then I think the crisis kind of faded away a little bit, and they kind of released these kind of measures in Mozambique. And there are still a lot of relationships between the two countries, but that happened. And it's happening also in other countries for sure. I wouldn't say it's a large trend, just because I think the unemployment rates in Africa are very high, so I think Europeans tend to go where the unemployment rates are lower. But there are some Europeans or Americans or Australians who move to Africa looking for a better life.
I'd just like to add that it's about who controls the narrative, right? And the person who controls the narrative is the West. They decide who is a refugee, who is a migrant, who is not this, and who is not the other. But the reality is that there is a lot of movements from the West to Africa, right? And it's primarily economic. They are going there for better jobs, higher paying jobs. And it's a reality, There was the case of Mozambique, like you mentioned. There's also Angola as well. Lots of Portuguese going to Angola. Lots of people coming to Nigeria. We don't call them immigrants. We call them expats. That's the terminology that has been handed down, by those who control the narrative. So that is a reality. It's happening. And to answer your question about religion and migration, it's this response to, if you like, the otherization of people. They are the others. They don't practice our religion. They don't look like us. They are Muslims. They are whatever they are. They are different from us. And it's the politics of playing up that fear, of projecting that fear for political gains. Even in Nigeria, it happens as well, with the internally displaced people. And people say, well, we're not sure if they're actually Boko Haram members or Boko Haram sympathizers. We are not entirely sure, so we don't know, right? And there are those who feel like, well, these people coming into my senatorial district or whatever are going to impact the outcome of elections in the future because maybe they don't support me, they don't support my party, so we need to get rid of them. So those are narratives that are, being played on. So in that case, you can't say, well, maybe they don't practice the same religion as I do. The religion is the same in most cases, right? So you kind of like look at the other aspects that you can project. Well, they are probably Boko Haram. They are extremists. Or maybe they are not. Maybe they're just terrorists. Or maybe they're just sympathizers. Those are things that are being projected in the media. It's a reality.
Abubakar, did you want to talk a bit about, did you want to say something, Joan?
Oh, God, no.
Okay. I know this may not be a huge trend, but you mentioned to me yesterday that some of the migrants spread disinformation. And I thought maybe you want to just talk about that.
Absolutely. It's true. There's no monopoly of misinformation, right? So the immigrants and migrants themselves, in certain cases, deploy the same weapon that is being deployed against them, right, to gain advantages. So they go to Europe and they say, well, there's this guy who is a US citizen now, and he left somewhere in East Africa and went to the US and said, well, I'm fleeing the crisis in some country there, and they killed off my family. All of them are dead. I'm an orphan. I'm all by myself. And he sang the national anthem, Star Spangled Banner, and they gave him a green card, right? And then, I've always thought that this person is alone in the world. He doesn't have family. And then he's like, oh, I'm going to see my dad. And I'm like, I thought your dad is dead. And he's like, no, I just told that lie so that I'll get this. People do this a lot, right? People have always used this misinformation. There are several instances. Some of them have escaped me now, but it happens.
You were mentioning Iceland yesterday.
Yeah. This funny Nigerian guy, right, went to Iceland, and he was claiming asylum, seeking asylum in Iceland. And after a while, the documentation didn't come through. They said, well, we're going to deport you. And the guy created a racket, got the media involved, and they said, oh, well, he's being targeted by Boko Haram. The moment he steps foot in Nigeria, he's a dead man. Boko Haram is looking for this guy. They want to kill him. And every single Nigerian that read that story started laughing, right? Because we know the fact, we know the reality. From his name, you know what part of Nigeria he comes from, right? He doesn't come from Boko Haram territory. He has no connection whatsoever with Boko Haram. And Boko Haram doesn't have the institutional memory to be hunting somebody for 4 years, right? Because he has left Nigeria 4 years before that. And then, and I said, well, except if he killed maybe Boko Haram's, the leader of Boko Haram's wife or something, and the man has a personal vendetta, there's absolutely no chance that this person is being targeted. But the media found it sensational, and they promoted the story. And there's a recent case of a boy who is, apparently some kind of chess genius, and he's being celebrated in the media as someone fleeing Boko Haram in Nigeria. And we looked at the story and we go, mm-mm. So there's a need for journalists as well when you're promoting this kind of stories. It's great that you do that, right? It's great that we do that, but it's also important to check the facts and ascertain that the claims these people are making are genuine, are real.
Okay, we have time for one more question in the back there. Yes.
Thank you so much for the fascinating talk. It's really inspiring. A situation that worries me a lot is that I realize the readers and audience are usually not homogeneous. What I mean is there are really awesome, brilliant contents out there, but the readers who will read it is usually the same group of people, and some people who just never read some great data. The other day I was trying to share articles with my friend, and he just screwed down and said, oh, this is too long, I don't want to read it. And I was just yeah, so even though like we can try to increase the contents and to put in data, and what else can we do to really reach a certain audience who traditionally don't read certain contents? I think that the notifications for fake news on Twitter is really brilliant, and any other suggestions?
Okay, thank you for your question. You want to take that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I tried to mention the problem of filter bubbles before. I think you're referring to that. And I think it's a very, very crucial problem because people tend to share content with the people who think alike. And that's how social media currently work. I think social media should review their algorithms in a way that the filter bubbles will get burst, so that there can be more kind of cross-pollination between bubbles. But I think you are spot on. That's a very important point. I think a common trend, like 10 seconds, is education here. We need to have better education in terms of media literacy, fact-checking, data literacy, so that people don't depend on algorithms, don't depend on fact-checking initiatives to get really like verified information, but they can already push back some fake news on their own.
And Joan, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, the other thing is the idea that organic virality and that this is all purposely happening through like user sharing is just a big myth. News organizations that are using news to spread political propaganda are investing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in advertising to make sure that their copy gets into many different diverse audiences' hands. And so the idea that the goodness of a story or that it's really well researched and it's really well done, without actually paying for distribution at this stage, you're not going to get the kind of traction or break out of those filter bubbles without using some of that technology.
I know there are more questions, but we can't take them because we have to switch rooms right now. But I want to thank the wonderful panelists for sharing their insights, and thank you for coming to the session.
That was good. Yeah, it did. I learned a lot.